Welcome, you're on The Fringe Show. I'm your host, Tatiana Zalan, and I go live every Friday at 2 p.m. Dubai time. The Fringe helps you to navigate the rapidly changing world and increase the odds of your success. Here we discuss technology, startups, entrepreneurs, and mental models of successful people so that you too can take advantage of the opportunities in the new digital world. Today is episode number 32, and we're continuing with the topic of metaverse. To metaverse or not to metaverse? The question, as I said, every business should be asking in 2022. It's really hot now, and it's part 3. Just to remind you where we've been with all this discussion, in part 1 of the show, I spoke about the opportunities in the metaverse with particular focus on the direct to avatar business model. I talked about the future of e-commerce and advertising, future of branding. And in part 2, I focused on the technological constraints as well as frictions on the customer side. And in this show, I'm bringing to you important legal issues and issues of social acceptability of the metaverse. So the question is, well, should businesses jump on the bandwagon right now? Should they wait? Managers must be prepared for what if something goes wrong. Metaverse, as I found out, and you probably will find it out after the show, is a legal minefield. And the show will be particularly useful for entrepreneurs. If you're maybe a business executive who is in charge of metaverse strategy at your company, maybe for marketers and brands, large or small, it will be useful for developers as well as normal people who might be users of the metaverse. Let me remind you, it's a live show, so please allow Facebook to identify yourself. A usual disclaimer, as always, what I'm presenting here is not financial advice, it's not legal advice or legal advice for that matter. Everything that I'm doing on The Fringe is for educational and informational purposes only. Now, the trigger for the show, I must confess, was an article in RT.com News. It's a news aggregator from Russia. And it was, the article itself was entitled, "Facebook's virtual reality world is for over 13-year-olds, but harassment, racism, talk of porn, and worse make it scary even for adults." And that kind of triggered my attention. What the article was about, that a beta tester, and her name is Nina Jane Patel, so she's a tester. She works for Horizon Worlds, that is Meta. She claimed that she was sexually assaulted by 3 to 4 male avatars with male voices. And she's the only beta tester so far to go public with such allegations. Meta, with all due respect, investigated the incident and determined that Patel hadn't taken full advantage of existing isolation features, and including the so-called block button. And she admits herself that she didn't use it, arguing it happened so fast that there was no time for her to even think of putting the safety barrier in place. And the company itself suggested it would make the block button and other options trivially easy and findable, but so far it hasn't done so. And that apparently was not sufficient for harassment proofing the metaverse, or Meta rather, Horizon Worlds in Meta's case. As I was getting some thoughts together for this show, I was just really surprised what are the whole host of issues related to social acceptability as well as legal issues in the metaverse. And it was really very difficult even to pick up those that would probably be of most interest to my audience, to you guys. But out of this host and whole universe of issues, I decided to focus on 3, and that's ownership and intellectual property, data and privacy issues related to biometrics as well, and user interactions, in particular things like assault, harassment, social engineering, and so-called nudging. It will become clear what I mean by that. Now, because the metaverse will collect more than ever user data, the consequence of if things go wrong will be worse than ever, I believe. And one of the major concerns here is, of course, privacy risk. For instance, all these technical giants, Apple, Amazon, and Google, and Facebook, and Microsoft, they have advocated for a very long time password-less authentication, which verifies the identity with a fingerprint, face recognition, or a PIN. And the metaverse is likely to continue this fashion, probably with even more biometrics such as voice recognition or iris recognition. Before, if you lose your password, the worst case is, well, you lost some data and made it a new one to guarantee other people's, or rather your data safety. But because biometrics are permanently associated with you, once they're compromised forever and cannot be revoked, and you would be in real trouble. There is a special issue around wearables collecting data as well. They may enable nefarious within metaverse tracking and surveillance, and this in turn is likely to be annoying at best, and at worst it will be dangerous. It will compromise user privacy and personal information. Today's privacy and data protection laws were built for physical filing cabinets and then updated for the internet. This is what Reed Smith, an international legal firm, is saying. They've recently released a brilliant report, very detailed one, on the legal issues surrounding the metaverse, and I certainly invite you to dive deep into it, and I'll highlight only some of the issues that they're talking about as well, and other analysts are talking. I'll put a link to this particular resource in the video afterwards. So determining who is responsible and which laws apply to the metaverse will be particularly challenging. The metaverse will connect the person to their avatar or other legal representation. And because of that, regulators all around the world would likely consider this information to be users' activities to be personal data, subject to existing privacy and data protection laws. Data interaction can be regulated based on a whole host of things. It can be physical location of the organization or the individual. It can be the type of organization or individual, say it may be a healthcare organization or a child, a minor. The type of data collected, it can be race, sexual orientation, and the purpose for collecting the data, for example, can be for marketing or profiling. And anything, this cross-section of laws is unwieldy, even in a relatively static environment, such as the current internet. Imagine what will happen in the metaverse. It is unclear how organizations could navigate their legal compliance in an interactive metaverse. Another question that Reed Smith talks about is who will be responsible for privacy in the metaverse? Possibly it will operate with single organizations, ecosystems, like similar to today's social media platforms, centrally operated platforms hosting different organizations offering their goods and services. But alternatively, it can have multiple access points and multiple controllers. That can be another design for the metaverse. And if governments hold organizations responsible for others' activities in the metaverse, it is difficult to even envision companies building anything but a collection of proverbial walled gardens that will not fulfill the promise of the metaverse. Another interesting question, how do you approach transparency and control in the metaverse? It could stretch notice and consent models to their limit. Most privacy laws around the world at the moment are based on the principle that individuals should know how their personal data is being used by whom, as well as for what purposes. In the last few years, we've seen this accelerating trend in such requirements with an ever-growing list that organizations need to tell their customers. I'm sure you can relate to that. Many privacy laws have individual rights with regard to their personal data, give individual rights to individuals with regards to their data, and the individuals are increasingly aware of those rights. That would be particularly clear to the European audience. In Europe, in particular, individuals are very active in exercising their right to be forgotten, their right to access their personal data, and many organizations in the last few years have dealt with the requests from consumers or employees and even ex-employees to delete all the data immediately or provide all of the data that the company holds on that person. So quite a nightmare for institutions. Another related issue is another challenge that the metaverse will need to address is how to handle sensitive information of the minors. Because, as you know, it's minors that constitute a wide proportion of increasingly sophisticated, tech-savvy users of VR and AR and generally extended reality. They're traditionally less aware of the risks involved in the processing of their data because they are minors. They may not be aware of the ethical issues associated with that. And it is often very difficult to establish whether a user is a child and whether valid consent, parental consent, has been given. So clearly, service providers in the metaverse should review the steps that they're taking to protect children's data on a regular basis. They also need to consider whether they can implement perhaps more efficient verification mechanisms rather than just simple informed consent mechanisms that we have now. And imagine trying to write a privacy notice for the metaverse, right? Let alone keeping it up to date. It's very difficult, truly a legal nightmare. Now, leaving aside data and privacy issues, what are some of the other issues? These are ownership and IP. Of course, now everybody is very excited and hyped about NFTs without really realizing that property rights around NFTs are not clear yet. What is actually being sold, as one of the analysts is asking? Is it copyright? Is it commercial permissions? Is it a digital file? For example, in the real world, when it comes to purchasing a piece of art, property law dictates that ownership is twofold. Firstly, ownership can be attributed to the actual physical artwork. And secondly, the buyer may or may not own the IP of the artwork, and that all depends on the terms of the sale. But what kind of ownership is precisely included in a transaction of digital art? Reed Smith, again, the international legal company, actually says that true ownership still lies with the owner in the case of NFTs. This may mean, for example, ownership in the metaverse is nothing more than a form of licensing or provision of services, and that the buyer cannot sell the item without permission from the true owner. So if you're owning a piece of virtual land, for example, or any type of NFT, you really need to be very careful whether you are the true owner or not. Virtual real estate has also become an NFT, with individuals and companies spending really significant sums of money, sometimes in the millions, to own property in the metaverse. And that gives a rise of very interesting questions like, do the intricacies of land law apply here? For example, can you take out a mortgage on your individual property? The metaverse may also be susceptible to all sorts of virtual marketplaces, somewhat like Silk Road, which was a dark web marketplace dealing in illegal drugs and weapons. What kind of laws need to be put in place to safeguard us against this happening in the metaverse? Again, that's very much an open question. And finally, let's have a look at user interactions and the legal issues around that. Every imaginable crime and tort that can be committed in the real world can also be committed in the metaverse. There are already reported cases of theft of virtual items and of sexual assaults, like we've just seen from this article, by one avatar of another, and this can cause genuine emotional harm. What would be the outcome if the avatar was assaulted and the user suffered a post-traumatic stress syndrome as a result? Could we apply criminal laws here? to this situation, laws of assault? How can we make an avatar responsible for their actions in the metaverse? And these questions are not far-fetched and they're not far off. Answering these questions will be very complicated because we need to attribute a legal persona to the avatar, giving them rights and duties within a legal system. Proving assault would be a lot more difficult in the metaverse because it usually requires actual bodily harm. In the metaverse, there will be no actual bodily harm. It would be challenging to prove harm, loss, or injury suffered by an avatar. And this comes back to the question of the legal personas of avatars. Is a legal persona necessary to make avatars responsible for their actions in the metaverse? Another open question. But these issues, and I think it's probably very important to stress, these issues should be addressed before the metaverse becomes mainstream and widely adopted. Then there is the question of social engineering and nudging that comes together with user interactions. That's another type of clear and present danger. Social engineering, hacking, a form of trickery that relies on human interactions that create a sense of urgency, fear, or other emotions, and that may lead to the individual revealing something of value. It may be valuable information, it may be even given money, something of that sort. Avatars controlled by these nefarious human users can easily engage in deceptive or unethical practices, impersonation, white lies, even manipulation. For example, an avatar could impersonate a place friend and obtain some secret or private information. And this is just about human-driven avatars. Wait until it gets to software-driven avatars. They are armed with ever-increasing training data sets and can employ machine learning, artificial intelligence to nudge human avatars in ways that could best serve their purposes. When combined with social engineering, this becomes a threat to privacy. For example, using in-game observations, that's a very plausible scenario. An AI-backed agent could come to understand what your tendencies are, what kind of personality you are. Are you an introvert, impulsive, extrovert? And what kinds of social interactions create the best nudges to lead you to particular outcomes, which are best for these software-driven avatars. It will eventually, that's what computer scientists say, it will be eventually impossible to differentiate between exclusively software-driven agents, that's chatbots and game bots, and human-driven avatars. So very, very tricky territory over there. Plus, there will be legal claims of negligence and product liability. It's almost certain there are going to be numerous claims like that by users against all these metaverse companies, particularly for personal injuries. The metaverse requires the use of a head-mounted device, so the user cannot actually see the actual environment they're in. If they attempt to walk around the home, they can easily trip, they can possibly fall down the stairs or even through a window. Imagine that. There are lots of studies and observations that show that the metaverse can be very real, and it can be very scary, and that may even lead to heart attacks. The metaverse can also cause significant nausea to the point of vomiting when the visuals are not aligned with bodily movements. Some people may become addicted to the metaverse, and some may be traumatized by events that occur in the metaverse because it's so real and so immersive. Without questions that there are going to be lawsuits of negligence and product liability against metaverse companies and suppliers of any type of hardware, software, and content. So not just metaverse companies, but also their suppliers might be liable. This has been a really big topic, and I'll probably let me stop right now here. Let me share some parting thoughts about metaverse and the legal and social acceptability issues. Now, it's a legal minefield, no doubt. Some of the issues could be addressed during the design and new product development stage. For some, there are technological solutions. For example, edge computing could help us with privacy. And we also need to have very careful consideration of all legalities. Perhaps you, if you're running your company's metaverse strategy, think about having an army of lawyers as well. But clearly, what needs to be emphasized and again, that all these issues need to be resolved before metaverse hits down the mainstream, becomes widely acceptable. So the question is for you, if you're an executive and an entrepreneur, maybe a developer or a marketer, what do you do given this? Yes, there are huge opportunities, but there are also significant frictions, including legal frictions. You need to apply what I call real options thinking. And so what that means is simple language. Don't go all in, experiment on a smaller scale, learn, invest more when uncertainty surrounding metaverse gets resolved, technological uncertainty, but also market acceptance. And I would be really interested to hear your thoughts about all these issues that we talked about today. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I shall see you on the Fringe next Friday at 2 p.m. Dubai time. And now it's time for some jazz.